Good morning, students. We'll just wait an extra minute to allow others to join in and then commence the lecture. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope you are doing well and staying safe. Before we commence today's lecture, by the way, can all of you hear me and see the screen? Just a show of hands, please. Yeah, wonderful. Before we commence today's lecture, do you have any questions from the previous one? Okay, if not, if you remember from the previous lecture, we left out a portion about net present value. So this is something I want to cover together with a seminar. So what I plan to do is after lecture 4, we'll actually have the first seminar wherein I'll introduce what we mean by net present value, and then we'll try and solve some problems then and there. So we'll spend those couple of hours to get really acquainted with this term, with this technique. And for whoever is interested in starting a career in banking or financial services, this is the most important method for you to know. All right. So if you remember what we discussed in the previous lecture, we started by trying to understand how important financial markets are. So we started by discussing that using the example of the circular economy between households and firms. And we discussed how intermediation between these households and firms is required by certain players. And these players, who are known as financial intermediaries, provide certain key functions that households and firms cannot provide on their own. So the most important function that these intermediaries provide is that they allocate the available capital in the most efficient manner possible, whether that's in terms of saving for households or borrowing or investing for firms. Okay, these intermediaries are best equipped to invest in the best available opportunities, and the way they do this is because of the fact that they are better able to produce and process that information to make an informed investment decision. And as part of these duties, they also try to minimize risk associated with a given investment and ensure safe storage of money. So we saw all of this, and we also discussed two key underlying theories which explain the need for financial markets, starting with the classical view and then move on to the modern view, which basically focuses on individual investment decisions and also acknowledges the fact that parties to an exchange of money might have certain information asymmetries with respect to each other. Right? We'll explore that in more in depth in today's lecture, this whole concept of information asymmetry. And lastly, and more importantly, we also discuss what we mean by the Fisher separation theorem, which shows that without financial markets, it would be difficult for individuals to separate their consumption preferences from their investment preferences or their investment decisions. And therefore, it would be difficult for two or more individuals with different consumption preferences to agree on where to co-invest. Okay. Moving further from these foundational discussions, today we'll take a more in-depth overview of the kind of economic importance of these financial intermediaries. So earlier, we were only discussing about how households and firms benefit from the presence of these intermediaries, but today we'll also expand this further and try and understand how do financial intermediaries affect the broader economy. Okay, and we'll also take a more historical perspective and try and understand how could something like the financial system come into existence over time. So we'll use something called the Goldsmith's anecdote to understand this. Lastly, we'll also look at the requirement for something called a central bank, which controls all the member banks within a given economy. And then also look how interconnected this whole banking system or the financial system is, comprising all these individual member banks. Okay. The relevant chapters for today's lecture are 2 and 3 from the main course textbook, Contemporary Financial Intermediation. So please be sure to read up these 2 chapters after today's lecture. These are pretty easy to read and follow. So and you might actually learn a lot more than what we can cover in these 2 hours. All right. So let's start the first module for today's lecture, which is financial intermediation. Now, as I mentioned previously, financial intermediaries are basically entities that facilitate the exchange or the allocation of capital between 2 or more parties. Now, in intermediating, the exchange of capital, they basically play the role of a broker, right? They use available information. If required, they might also be in a position to produce new information in order to screen and match providers of capital and the seekers of capital, right? So screening points to the fact that if you have 10 different applicants for a loan, the question is, how do you screen amongst them and identify the most creditworthy borrowers and hopefully give them a loan? And then the question is, how do you match, let's say, loan seekers with loan providers, the money providers who provide it in the form of deposits? Another important role that intermediaries provide is this concept called qualitative asset transformation. Now, if this term sounds too complicated, don't worry about it. We'll discuss that quite elaborately today. But basically, the question is, how do intermediaries process this information that they have access to in order to manage and minimize risks? Okay. And secondly, when facilitating the exchange of capital between providers and seekers, intermediaries help transform the characteristics of the money that is being exchanged, whether that's in terms of the duration for which the money is invested or the risk associated with that money and various other characteristics associated with it, like liquidity and whatever. Okay. Now, remember, there are serious issues related to the direct exchange of capital because, first of all, under the neo-institutional view, we already discussed that the world is characterized by imperfect information. So imagine you are a rich investor, right? You have, let's say, $1 billion to spend, and you wish to invest it somewhere. You maybe decide to give them out as loans to whoever might be needing it. And the question is, what kind of issues might you face in being able to provide those loans or make those investments? One thing to remember is that information issues related to this direct exchange of capital can exist both before and after a transaction. Okay. When information problems exist prior to the exchange of money, we call this as adverse selection. Okay. So for example, let's say the market knows that you are this rich investor willing to lend money, and you probably have a number of applicants asking you for a loan. Now, a serious problem with that is that some of these borrowers might actually overstate their creditworthiness. So, meaning they might fake their credentials, their information, the amount of money that they have. Maybe they fake their salary. Basically, they show a different picture about themselves than what they really are. So, what happens as a result? If you, as an investor, you have a lot of money, but probably you don't have the financial expertise to be able to get access to true information about those borrowers. And therefore, you have certain limitations in being able to process or get the required information. So what happens as a result? If you believe what your what your applicants are telling you, then you might give them the money, and it might not have gone to the best creditworthy borrowers. So that's where adverse selection problems exist. So adverse selection is basically a case where two parties to an exchange have different access to information, but whatever information is being provided by the seeker is actually fraudulent, is not qualitative enough. Okay. Another problem that can exist prior to a transaction is duplication. So imagine you are the investor, but you don't have the necessary financial expertise or the tools to process information. Then for every potential loan applicant that comes to you, you might have to screen them individually. You need to spend enough sufficient money, time, and resources in order to screen each of those individual applicants and then decide whether to provide money or not. So there's duplication of efforts, which is also a big problem associated with the direct exchange of capital. Now, contrast this. Let's assume that regardless of any adverse selection and duplication problems that might exist, you issue loans to a certain number of applicants, right? Some fraction of applicants. Do you think your problems are solved, right? Let's say you give out loans for, let's say, 5 years. Do you think your problems are solved? Even if you have, let's say, resolved all your information problems prior to a transaction. Let's say you resolved your adverse selection issues as an investor. Do you think your problems are finished? What might happen afterwards? Any guesses? You have the slides, so I'm guessing you can at least look at them. Hello? Well, even after a transaction finishes, there are serious information problems which are collectively known as moral hazard issues. Okay, so what do we mean by moral hazard? Imagine you lent out money to somebody, and as part of this loan process, you also write a contract. But if your contract is not strong enough, if it does not set out the terms and conditions and punitive actions, then what might occur is that borrowers might simply violate the terms of the contract. So if I take a loan for a house and I stop making my monthly interest payments, then I basically violate the terms of a contract. The question then is whether that investor has enough legal recourse, whether they have enough, let's say, whether they can discipline those violating borrowers, should that violation occur. So if that doesn't happen, then borrowers might indulge in this moral hazard problem and benefit at the expense of the lender, the investor. So these actions are sometimes hidden. So if I just run away without paying my interest payments, then there might be some time before my investor finds out that I've actually not stopped making my payments and I've actually vacated the house. So in those cases, moral hazard issues typically tend to be hidden and might actually be quite difficult to prevent or control, especially when investors are directly providing the money. So you can clearly see information problems, information asymmetry can actually have serious consequences both before and after. So remember, pre-transaction, it's always adverse selection. Post-transaction, it's always moral hazard, right? So what is a better thing to do? Rather than invest it directly, investors would like to invest through an intermediary who obviously they know and trust, and probably the intermediary is reputed enough in the market, and they would entrust all their money to the intermediary so that the latter can actually allocate that capital in the best and most efficient form possible. Okay. Any questions on this? This is a very important concept. Okay. Now, contrast the previous slide where we discussed a direct exchange of capital. Someone just sent a message. Yes, in a way, yeah. So the question here is the idea that the intermediary takes some of the risk away from the investor? In principle, yes, because by accepting to invest money on behalf of that investor, the intermediary is assuming some of that risk. But then the question is whether the intermediary is capable enough to diversify away that risk, to mitigate the risk. The simplest way to do that is by only lending out or investing that money in the most creditworthy applicants, borrowers. Okay. Now, contrast this situation with a case where the allocation of capital is happening through an intermediary. Now, intermediaries, unlike investors investing directly, are capable of resolving both adverse selection and moral hazard problems. How can an intermediary resolve pre-transaction adverse selection issues? Well, obviously, most of these intermediaries, I mean, the people working in these firms, they have specialized skills. They probably have degrees in finance and economics, and they have the necessary skills to identify all risk factors and gather the required information to know more about prospective borrowers or prospective capital seekers, right? In the case of banks undertake extensive credit analysis to sort borrowers. Sort borrowers basically means if you have N applicants, you're sorting them based on the creditworthiness, and you're giving loans only to an upper fixed threshold fraction of these creditworthy borrowers. So how does a bank sort individual borrowers? It does this through credit analysis, which will be covered extensively in the next lecture. Okay. So another important thing is that unlike in the previous case where the investor had to personally know and trust each potential applicant, here with the presence of an intermediary, the capital seekers do not necessarily have to know the capital providers do not necessarily have to know the seekers personally. They can simply rely on the intermediary to invest that money without knowing who the ultimate seeker is, who the ultimate borrower is. So that's the way. Imagine you have savings in a bank in the form of deposits, and obviously those deposits are being lent out to some loan borrowers. Do you personally know every borrower that the bank issues a loan to? No, right? So that's another important advantage that intermediaries provide. You simply invest your money and you forget about where that money goes to, under the belief that the intermediary would do a good job, a better job than you can do it on your own. Okay. And how can intermediaries also invest efficiently? They can do so because they are in a position to reuse all the information that they've collected in the past. And therefore, in doing that, they provide significant cost savings. Okay. So any information that is collected on borrowers of past loans can actually be used to provide new loans, to understand new borrowers. They can do this both in the cross section, meaning for a given loan, at a given point in time, you can use the prior information about previous loans and borrowers to understand all current loan applicants. You can also understand the characteristics of an individual borrower over time. You can judge how well they are performing when it comes to their loan repayment and various things. So information can actually be used both at the current moment in the cross section and also intertemporally over time. Okay. And obviously, intermediaries are also well equipped to resolve post-transaction problems. Many of these intermediaries, like banks, have huge legal teams who are specialized in writing very, very intricate contracts that not only make sure that the borrowers are monitored at all times, as long as the loan is valid, but should a borrower, let's say, violate the terms of a contract by stopping interest payments or by by simply running away with the loan money that was provided, then intermediaries like banks are also equipped to discipline those borrowers. They can probably go to court and ensure that the borrowers are punished. They can also write conditions in the contract. These are known as covenants. Again, this will be covered in the next lecture, but covenants are basically conditions that the borrowers must follow at all times. Like probably a simple covenant could be that a given borrower will not be allowed to borrow another loan from a different bank. That's a simple covenant. That's a restrictive covenant, right? Similarly, if a borrower, like a firm, goes to the same bank regularly for successive loans, then if the firm violates the terms of a current loan, then probably it might be denied a loan in the future, or any future borrowing can become much more expensive than the current loan. So these are some ways in which intermediaries can discipline and minimize moral hazard problems. So if the borrower knows that these punishments exist, then they will be incentivized not to violate the terms of a contract. And even if contractual terms are violated, so for instance, if you stop paying interest rates on your home loan, then a bank is well equipped to take possession of your property by going to court. So there's also transfer of control, which is another disciplinary mechanism to resolve moral hazard issues. Okay, let's take a small example to understand the third problem that we discussed pre-transaction wise, which is the issue of duplicated screening. So let's take a small example. Consider a marriage market, right? This is again a matching market, just like financial markets, where there are X men and X women, and each of these is looking for a partner. Now, at the very outset, there is no intermediary, meaning there is no broker. So therefore, every individual is responsible for searching for a partner on their own. And each search for a potential partner costs C. Okay. So the question is, what is the total search cost of all men and women in this market? Okay. When we start physical lectures from lecture 4, this is when I'll start to work out each of these problems on the blackboard. For now, I'm limited in how much I can solve by hand. So please bear with me for the time being. Let's take 5 minutes to solve this problem. I know you have the solution slides. I hope you have not gone through the solution. Let's take 5 minutes to try and solve this problem and understand it better. So can you provide an expression for the total search costs for all men and women? So the aggregate search cost for all men and women in this market. Let's take just a couple of minutes. It's a very simple problem. You can type or read out your answers. Remember, okay, CX plus CX. So you're saying 2CX. Okay. Any other answers? Yeah, 2CX squared. Let's see how to work this out. All right. So remember, this is an unbrokered market. So every individual from a given gender would have to evaluate every other individual from the opposite gender, right? So every woman must evaluate each of the X men in the market, right? So since each evaluation costs C, the costs for each woman to screen X men is C times X. Now, given that there are X women in the market, the total cost borne by all women is CX squared, right? So you multiply CX times the number of X women, that gives you CX squared. And the same applies for men on the opposite side, right? So similarly, men also expend the same amount of costs, search costs, in finding women as a partner. So therefore, the total search cost is 2CX squared. Okay. Now let's flip this, make some changes to this market. Now consider this second case where there's actually a single broker who's solely responsible for arranging partners, right? So the X-men and X-women no longer interact with each other directly. So unlike the direct exchange of capital, here you have an intermediated market where there's actually a broker, and the broker alone is responsible for matching each men and each women. Okay, and again, each evaluation costs C. So what is the total search cost in this intermediate market? Yes, 2CX. That's right. Yes. So again, simple, much more simpler than the previous question. So because remember, unlike the previous case of direct search, here, given that you have a broker, they only need to scan each man and each woman once in this market, right? And they have all the information that they need. They know the preferences of each man and they know the preferences of each woman. Each search costs C, and therefore they only need to get information on each individual just once. So the cost to evaluate all X women in the market by the single broker is C times X. Similarly, the cost to evaluate all X men is again C times X. So the total search cost in this intermediated market is 2CX. So the cost savings between this intermediated market and the direct search market is 2CX squared from the previous slide minus 2CX. And therefore you end up with this expression. So this gives you the cost savings as a result of having a single broker make all the matchings. Okay, let's take a small example. Again, this is just a synopsis of the two cases that we just solved. So let's say the search cost for per unit to evaluate a single individual is $25. And let's say there are 100 individuals on each side. Okay, that is, there are 100 men and 100 women. How much is the cost saving? If you apply this expression here, you get savings of about 495,000. So that's about 99% cost savings compared to case one. So if you apply case one, this would be, I think, close to $500,000. Okay. Yeah, it's $500,000. So the total cost savings as a result of having this market intermediated is 99% of the original cost, right? Again, why does what explains these cost savings? It's simply because of the fact that information collected once by the broker can be reused to make multiple matches, and therefore this results in significant cost savings. Okay, and the cost savings are actually exponential, X squared, as a function of the number of individuals in that market. Okay. Let's focus now. So we have understood that intermediation saves on costs. It saves on cost because it reduces the scope for duplication of information or the duplication of efforts. Now let's look at qualitative asset transformation. So what do we mean by that? Now imagine all of us are savers. We basically deposit our excess money, our excess wages in the form of deposits into a bank, right? So the bank owes us this money because if you want some money, if you want to withdraw some money from the bank, you can just go to an ATM and withdraw cash. So it's the liability, it's a liability for the bank. It owes you a liability to provide you that money whenever you demand it. Okay. What are characteristics, some of the characteristics of deposits? Well, for once, they're divisible to some extent. You can, if you go to a bank and if you have enough money, you can actually draw $1,000 or $100 or $10 or even $1. It's up to you. So the deposit itself is divisible. It is highly liquid. Liquid means you get access to your deposits on demand. You don't have to wait. And therefore, there's high liquidity associated with deposits. And obviously, there is no default risk because the bank guarantees that your deposits are safe. And even in the case of bankruptcy, the government guarantees that your deposits are safe. So there's no default risk. The bank, your deposits will never go away, right? What does a bank provide in return? So you provide money to the bank so that it can use it for to invest somewhere else. In return, the bank promises to pay you a guaranteed interest rate D, R of D on your deposits. Okay, so this is one end of the equation. What does the bank do with all your deposits? It needs to do something with it. What it does is it converts all these deposits in the form of loans and lends them out to prospective borrowers. Now, all these borrowers owe these loans to the bank. So therefore, the loans represent liabilities for each of these borrowers with respect to the bank. Okay. What are some characteristics of loans? Loans are non-divisible. So if I borrow $1,000 from a bank, I cannot divide and only pay 500 out of it. It's non-divisible. I have to pay the entire amount. It is highly illiquid, meaning if a bank gives me $1,000 and gives me 5 years to repay that loan, it cannot come back to me after 1 year and say, "Now I need this money urgently and just pay me back whatever you owe me." It just doesn't happen. And even if you own a house, you cannot sell it immediately and repay that loan, right? Oops, sorry about the interruption. Can all of you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just a question.
Yes.
What do you mean by non-divisible? Why would you borrow like $1,000 and only, like use half of it? What did you mean with non-divisible?
So non-divisible basically means that once a loan is issued, right, it cannot be chopped up by the bank as at once. Or even the borrowers, they owe the full obligation to the bank, right? So in that sense, you cannot just go back to the bank and say, "I'm only going to pay $500. That just doesn't work. So in that sense, the term non-divisibility means, unlike the case of deposits where you can just withdraw as much money as you want, as long as you have that sufficient money in the bank, loans are not subdivisible, right? They are illiquid because a bank cannot extract all its loans at once on demand. It just doesn't work out. And there's always a default risk because some of the borrowers might actually default on their loans. It happens quite often, especially during financial crisis. So do you see big differences between the characteristics of deposits and loans? They're completely different to each other, right? So what is happening? Every dollar that was provided in the form of deposit is changing hands and going on to borrowers, but the nature of that money itself is undergoing some transformation. That is exactly what we mean by this term here, qualitative asset transformation.
So do you mean like, for example, deposits are divisible and liquid and they have no default risk when they're in the hands of the bank?
Yes.
Okay, and otherwise for the loans?
Otherwise, for the loans, they're completely different in that sense, in all these characteristics. Again, there's a big default risk because you normally see that on average, if you look at existing statistics, about 4 to 5% of all loans tend to default for various reasons. Either borrowers willingly don't repay, or they might fall into financial problems, right? Firms go bankrupt. So if firms go bankrupt, then they are in no position to repay those loans. So in those cases, those loans are termed to have gone into default. Okay. Yeah. So what do borrowers pay in return? They pay an interest rate to compensate the bank for the loan that they received. So the bank basically makes money on the differential between these two interest rates, the interest rate that it receives from these loans and the interest rate that it pays to borrowers for the deposits. Okay, that's how the bank makes money. So where exactly is qualitative asset transformation occurring here? Here, the banks transform deposits into loans and consequently change the duration for which that money is exchanged, right? Deposits, you can keep the deposit in your bank for an unlimited amount of time as long as the bank exists. But loans are always issued for a fixed term, right? You can already see there's a big change in the characteristics such as liquidity, and there's also a big change in the credit risk associated with that unit of money. There's a big credit risk here, especially default risk, but there's no default risk whatsoever. So you see big transformations happening with money. as a result of these exchange of hands, right? Now, one important thing to note is even though banks take on a lot of default risk by lending out that money, banks also have certain tools to minimize that risk. They can either diversify them away. So for example, in today's markets, banks often sell large parts of their loans to interested third parties. We'll cover that under securitization. But basically, they sell out their loans to others. And most often, they reduce their exposure to any one particular type of loan. So if you take the typical bank, a bank provides some part of its loans to students, some parts of its loans to fund the purchases of homes, some parts of it to purchase, to finance the purchase of cars and other automobiles. And some of it also goes into credit card debt. So basically, they're diversifying away their loan portfolio by lending out to different sectors so that even if one sector fails at some point, the other loans are still safe. So you diversify away your risk by investing in multiple loan classes. So that's another important strategy that banks adopt in order to minimize the risk associated with their loans. Okay. And sometimes not all of these loans can be sold or diversified away completely. And therefore, to some extent, banks have to accept default risk with some of those loans. Okay. All right. Let me cover, we still have 10 minutes in this session. So let me cover at least part of what the broader purpose of financial intermediation. Any other questions so far until now? All right. If you have any questions, just interrupt. I'm happy to answer at any point in time. Okay. All right. Now, you might still not be convinced why intermediaries might be necessary, right? Why can't people still exchange their capital directly? For example, why can't lenders and borrowers transact directly? And you might also wonder what kind of a broader role do these intermediaries play within the broader economic system, right? Often not. Firms also face these choices when it comes to raising money from outside. They also need to determine in what form to raise that money. Should a firm go for a loan by raising it from a bank, or should it go to the stock market and raise money in the form of equity financing? So these are typical decisions that firms have to make when they seek external money, right? There's also this question of whether these intermediaries should be regulated in some form or the other, because some intermediaries, we know from the past, tend to take on too much risk if they are not regulated. So the question is, what is the best mechanism to regulate these intermediaries? And how can bad behavior amongst these intermediaries be controlled and mitigated away? So to understand all of these concepts, we need a framework, which we'll cover in the next few minutes. Okay, so to understand the broader role played by intermediaries within the economy, let's take a simple example of an economy comprising 4 different individuals. Okay, Mary, Peter, Paul, and Sally. Now, Mary, she's a rich lady, and she has a lot of money saved at a safe in her house. Okay, and her sole objective is to be able to invest that money somewhere in return for larger future payments, in return for some bigger payments in the future. Now, Peter, on the other hand, is a farmer whose job is to grow apples, but he's poor. He does not have any money to pay for any seeds or fertilizers or equipment that he might require to produce apples on his farmland. Now, the third and fourth individuals, Paul and Sally, are owners of factories that produce the fertilizers and equipments, the factors of production that Peter needs in order to grow apples in a maximal way. But their condition, Paul and Sally have a condition that they need to be paid upfront for all purchases of fertilizers and equipment. So what happens in this context? Do you think the economy will function based on these financial constraints? What do you think? Can it still proceed? Can Peter still purchase equipments from Paul and Sally and be able to grow apples, but he does not have any money, right? So what happens is, without the presence of a financial intermediary like a bank, Mary obviously will be unwilling to lend her money to Peter because she doesn't know Peter. She doesn't want to expend any money or effort to get to know Peter. And probably she doesn't even trust Peter to be a genuine person. So Mary will be unwilling to lend. Paul and Sally will be unwilling to sell any fertilizer or equipment. And therefore, Peter, because he is unable to purchase the inputs that he requires to produce more apples, will be left to producing only the apples that his land can generate, or maybe not produce anything at all. So therefore, here, in the absence of an intermediary, you have an economy that simply ceases to function. Okay. Now contrast this with a new financial system comprising a bank. Here, unlike the case directly with Peter, Mary trusts the bank with her money because the bank obviously is reputed. It is well known in the market. And therefore, Mary is more than happy to place her money as a deposit with the bank because the bank guarantees a return on it. And more importantly, keeps it safe. Now, what happens? Although Peter was unable to raise that money from Mary directly, he's now able to go to the bank and raise a loan, again using Mary's money. And he can then use that to buy fertilizers and equipment. So here you have a better functioning economy where Mary provides her money to the bank, and the bank lends that money to Peter. Peter pays for fertilizer and equipment and is able to produce apples more efficiently. Okay. So one important service that this economy provides, comprising a bank, is that it allows the combination of capital and labor in a more efficient manner to maximize production, thereby maximizing utility for all the players involved here. Okay. What happens in the case of Paul and Sally? Because they get paid upfront and they know that Peter might require more inputs later on, they will increase the production of fertilizers and equipment and therefore contribute more to purchasing machinery. They might also hire more workers under the expectation that Peter will come back to them in the next period and demand more fertilizer and equipment. So there's also increased production as a result of the presence of this intermediary. So you see that the economy starts to function properly. Okay. So the economic system, the financial system comprising a bank or a group of banks provides three key services. First, the financial system facilitates trade. It moves us away from this so-called barter system, right? So all of you, I guess, know what a barter system is, right? What is a barter system? Any thoughts?
Exchange of goods for other goods.
Yeah. So if I have apples and I need oranges, I need to first find somebody who has oranges and who wants apples, right? Unless I find somebody with that matching, I won't be able to exchange my apples for someone else's oranges, right? So therefore, you face a problem of double coincidence of wants in a barter economy. So in a barter economy, trade is very, very limited. Okay. Now, with the presence of a financial system where money is actually being used and there are banks providing funds, trade is facilitated. And this financial system allows the use of money to be used as a form of payment. Therefore, goods can be exchanged more easily, right? Second thing, the financial system also helps mobilize resources. It encourages people to provide their money to banks in the form of savings. It encourages them to invest their savings. And more importantly, these savings can be invested in further innovation and efficiency improvement. So Paul and Sally will not only invest in producing more fertilizer and equipment, they can also use that money, a part of it, to also produce better fertilizer and better equipment. So the financial system also engages the associated people to innovate further and improve the existing efficiency even more. And lastly, throughout all this process, information is generated, and this information can also be used by the intermediaries like banks to provide further cost advantages to all the parties involved. So depending on how Peter performs and pays the loan, the bank collects information and decides whether to provide a new loan to Peter more cheaply or for a longer period, or both, right? So in that sense, the financial system provides a number of significant advantages compared to a system where people are forced to engage directly with each other and also engage in a barter system of trade. All right. Okay. So now, so far we have discussed, I think in the last lecture and a half, we have discussed in depth the kind of benefits that the financial system provides, the kind of important roles that intermediaries provide when it comes to exchange of capital, and also the more important role that they play for the economy to function in general. So now in the next part of today's lecture, let's take a more historical perspective and try and understand how a financial system evolves from nothing. Okay, so let's see that in the next lecture. So it's about 11 o'clock now. Let's get back at 11:15 to finish, to cover the next part of the lecture. All right, thank you. All right, let's begin the next session. So, as I mentioned, in this part, we'll focus on how a financial system might have evolved from the very beginning. Okay, so to understand that, we'll use something called the goldsmith's anecdote or the goldsmith story. Okay, now assume we have an ancient economy in which gold is the medium of is the form of money. So, if you've read a bit of economic history, you will know that precious metals like gold and silver were used to as a form of payment back in the ancient days. So therefore, we'll use that same analogy here. So basically, all purchases and payments are made with gold in this economy. And one of the key problems with using gold as a form of payment is that it poses serious security risks. It's not safe to store gold at home, or at least in large quantities. And it's also difficult to carry around and transport. So if you're a trader and you have to make a lot of payments during a day, then carrying a lot of gold is very cumbersome. It's too tiresome, right? So therefore, overall, we collectively call this as a convenience problem. Okay? It's a problem. It inconveniences us to carry so much gold and trade in it. So what happens as a result is, because of this convenience problem, the exchange of money and naturally the amount of trade is limited, because paying and getting paid in gold is quite problematic. So what happens as a result is overall economic activity tends to be much less constrained, and it's also inefficient because of this convenience problem. Okay. Now, imagine that someone called a goldsmith recognizes this problem and tries to resolve it. How can they do this? They can basically create a new banking system by offering storage services for gold. So all in all, the goldsmith is simply saying, is providing a service saying that he or she will accept gold from all the individual people owning gold in the market, obviously in return for a small storage fee. And what the goldsmith does in return is that he or she will issue certain paper receipts, which can be used to redeem gold when required. So if you want to get rid of this convenience problem, you just go to a goldsmith, you deposit your gold, and the goldsmith will give you back a paper receipt. If you need to redeem your gold at some point in the future, you just have to take your paper receipt to the goldsmith. The goldsmith will verify it and then give you back your amount of gold, depending on what's stated on the receipt. So this is one way that the convenience problem is mitigated. Okay. Now, how would a typical payment work in this new banking system? Well, let's imagine a market comprising two actors, A and B, and A and B need to have the need to trade with each other. So in this context, A would first have to go to the goldsmith and withdraw their gold by presenting the receipt. Once they do that and get back gold from the goldsmith, they can pay the gold to person B, who will then provide the goods. And then once B receives the gold in return for providing those goods, he would then go back to the goldsmith and deposit that gold for a fee. All right. This is how a typical payment would occur in the system in order for a trade to occur. Do you see any problem with this? With this whole arrangement?
The gold
Yeah.
ends up in the same place it's withdrawn from. So it's like, yeah, unnecessary.
Exactly. So again, this is quite cumbersome, right? Every time you need to trade with someone else, you have to go to the goldsmith and get your gold back. And the person who receives your money will also have to go back to the goldsmith, right? So people in the market start to see this as an inefficient way of using money, right? So then, obviously, repeat trips to the goldsmith are wasteful, and they can often be expensive, right? And time consuming. So what happens is, if the reputation of the goldsmith grows over time, then people in the market have lesser and lesser need to go to make frequent trips to the goldsmith. So to minimize these trips, what happens is that people will start exchanging the gold receipts as a form of payment. They won't require the actual gold to pay each other, right? Why is that happening? Why do people start trading in gold receipts and not gold? How can they do that? Under what basis are they comfortable trading in gold receipts?
Because they know that the goldsmith will repay them if they require to.
Exactly. So they know that every paper receipt that is out there in the market, which is the new money, is actually backed by an equal amount of gold that is held with the goldsmith, right? So what happens is organically, naturally, over time, more and more trade starts to get conducted using the exchange of receipts, right? The original gold, all the gold that is backing these receipts remains undisturbed with the goldsmith, okay? So what happens as the receipts start to get more and more traded, more and more used for payments, the reputation of the goldsmith increases further, but no one bothers to check whether the goldsmith is having that amount of gold with him or her or not, okay? Do you see a problem with this? What happens if people stop checking if the goldsmith has enough gold to back up those paper receipts?
Maybe the goldman can produce more receipts than it actually has because it expects to like get gold all the time. So it basically lend out more gold than it actually has.
Yes. So basically, because of this new system, the goldsmith is actually incentivized to start printing more paper receipts. Okay, because he or she knows that nobody's going to check up or verify whether there is enough gold with the goldsmith to back up all that paper receipts. So therefore, maybe out of greed or maybe just to make a quick killing in the market, what the goldsmith will do is basically increase the money supply by printing more paper receipts. What can he do with using these extra paper receipts? He can simply lend them out, okay, and make a money on the interest rate that they get, right? So therefore, what the goldsmith is doing in return is that by issuing these extra paper receipts as loans, they are also providing something called a liquidity transformation service. So they're using the liquid gold deposits, right, and issuing illiquid loans. Okay, so again, qualitative asset transformation at play here. Now, obviously, if the goldsmith, has an opportunity to print more money, then that is backed by the units of gold that he or she has. Look at the difference in the balance sheets here. So remember, a balance sheet basically gives a snapshot of the financial picture of that entity, the financial health of that entity, or the wealth of that entity, however you may call it. In the previous case, when the paper receipts were backed by an equal amount of gold, on the liability side, you had a total deposits of $100, 100. Okay, we won't care about the units. Each of these individual 100 deposits was backed by 100 units of gold. All right. What happens afterwards when the goldsmith prints extra money? The gold remains unchanged. It remains at 100 units, but the loans, there's this new entry called loans. So the goldsmith printed 20 extra paper receipts and lent them out as loans somewhere. But that has to be reflected on the liability side of the balance sheet as well. Remember, for a balance sheet, total assets must always equal total liabilities. So therefore, by issuing out 20 paper receipts extra as loans, the deposits also increase by 120. Why does that happen? Imagine I get one of these 20 loans. I might use that to pay someone else, but that person who received my payment does not know that I took a loan to pay that money, right? They're simply believing that it's just another unit of money, and they keep trading on using that for their subsequent payments. So therefore, on the liabilities side of this goldsmith, the deposits are at 120. What has happened as a result? The goldsmith has turned into a banker, right? You can clearly see deposits exceed the actual amounts of gold backed as assets. Okay. What happens if there is a financial crisis? Let's say there's a rumor in the market that the goldsmith is fraudulent, that he or she has committed theft or done some illegal things. And suddenly all these depositors who hold these paper receipts rush to withdraw their money, withdraw their gold. What happens? Would all of them get serviced? No, right? Remember, here these are deposits. So one of the promises made by goldsmith is to pay on demand. So if I take my paper receipt and submit it to the goldsmith, I immediately will get a unit of gold. But here, because the goldsmith lent out more in the form of loans, his promise to pay on demand will be violated. So therefore, there is a serious risk that the goldsmith can collapse, go bankrupt, if all the depositors rush to withdraw their money. Okay. Yes, so this is actually called bank runs. We'll see for more examples in lectures 4 and 5 of what we mean by bank runs and why those might occur in some serious situations. So in lecture 4, for example, we'll talk about securitization and how that actually led to serious bank runs way back in 2007, 2008, okay, and caused a major financial crisis. So without proper oversight, unless there is some greater entity that is checking the actions of this goldsmith is actually vulnerable to collapse, to bankruptcy. Okay. And actually, this habit of printing more money than the actual amount of gold held is the basis for what we call the fractional reserve banking system. In fact, most of our financial systems, most of the fiscal monetary systems out at play, whether that's in the United States or in Norway or in the UK or wherever, most of these are based on a fractional reserve banking system. So basically, the banking system, the monetary system in each of these countries runs on the idea that only a fraction of deposits are there to back all the money that is in circulation within those respective systems. Okay. Which is why if there is a financial collapse like a crisis and everyone rushes to withdraw their money, some banks tend to fail if they cannot service all those deposits. So how can one save such a banking system from potential collapse? Imagine the system has evolved even further. There are many more individuals who realize that they can also become goldsmiths. So each becomes a banker and each starts to print extra money than the amount of gold that they hold. So here the problem is, one of the key problems that can lead to a collapse is that these loans are illiquid. Now, you might argue that if all 120 receipt holders go back and demand their money, then apart from paying the first 100 receipts, these loans can also be, called back so that all these deposits can be serviced. But that doesn't happen. As I said, loans are quite hard to retrieve in quick time. So therefore, one of the major problems affecting the promise to pay on demand is that these loans, many loans tend to be illiquid. Okay. So what could be one solution? Well, one simple solution is that now, because there are multiple goldsmiths operating in the market, all of them can pool at least some of their resources and create this entity called a central bank, right? Or a banker's bank of sorts. So what would be the prime function of a central bank? First, it would ensure that none of the goldsmiths operating within that system is taking on too much risk, printing too many receipts. Second thing is, if any goldsmith faces problems when it comes to deposit, when it comes to their ability to service deposits, then they can simply approach the central bank and ask for some assistance, maybe a temporary loan, maybe some temporary gold, so that they can service some of those deposit holders. Okay. So in other words, a central bank is nothing but a lender of last resort for all the member banks involved. Okay. And this is actually the basis for modern central banks, which started with what are known as commercial bank clearing houses. So these were private agreements amongst American banks back in the 19th century. So again, in the 19th, even until the 19th century, the banking system was privately held. The government did not have much control over the monetary system. Since then, most governments have taken over control and they regulate the monetary system in their respective jurisdictions using central banks, which they control. Okay. And obviously, central banks today are able to do that because they can print unlimited amount of money to service any kind of obligations that the member banks might face. Okay. Now, tell me one thing. So we recognized one important problem that goldsmiths might face if they print too much money. So to mitigate that problem and help any goldsmith in need, they all pooled their resources together and created this lender of last resort, which is also known as a central bank. Does that solve the problem on its own? Tell me without looking at the next slide. Do you think this solves the problem or not? Say just a yes or no. And why?
Maybe it doesn't, because the fundamental problem of banks being imprudent is still there. And even if the central bank exists, they too can experience some of the similar problems, perhaps.
Okay, so we talked about two key problems related to information asymmetry. So which of these would it represent? In the previous session, we discussed about, yeah, so there is actually a moral hazard problem here, right? Right, this is post-transaction. You already create, the loans have been issued. You already created a central bank. So this is post-transaction in nature. Again, always when you have to distinguish between whether a given problem, which is information-based, is pre or post-transaction, always try to define what the transaction is, right? Sometimes you can have more than one together. So here we have already created a central bank. The loans have been issued. So we are basically looking at information problems that might exist afterwards. So therefore, the creation of a central bank does not necessarily solve the problem that a banking system might collapse. The creation of a central bank has actually introduced a big problem of moral hazard, because without the existence of this bank, the central bank, the goldsmiths, each goldsmith was on their own, right? If they printed too much money, then any consequences would have to be borne only by them, right? And that in itself would act as a check and balance, because if each goldsmith was on their own, they would try not to print too many receipts so as to hurt their liquidity position, right? But now, with the central bank existing, goldsmiths know that even if they face serious issues, they can always go back and lend some money from it, lend some gold from it, right? So what would that happen? What would that do? It would actually encourage goldsmiths to issue more paper receipts, print a lot more money, and release that in the form of loans into the system. So that's where we have serious issues. Okay. Another way to resolve this problem is to impose certain regulation. So a central bank can actually impose certain conditions called reserve requirements on each of these goldsmiths, meaning in simple terms, these reserve requirements are basically certain ratios that banks have to follow. For example, a simple reserve ratio could be the maximum fraction of extra money that a given goldsmith can print and release as extra loans. Okay, that's a basic definition of a reserve requirement. So to understand this further, let us look at the last series of slides, which basically try and explain what we mean by the interconnectedness within the banking system. Okay, this will help us understand the role played by central banks and how each bank is connected to each other within the financial system. Okay. Again, remember, we talked previously just a while ago about the balance sheet of a bank. So the balance sheet at the very outset comprises of assets and liabilities, wherein the liabilities, the main liability of a bank are deposits. And on the other end, you have reserves, which are used for safekeeping to prevent the bank from collapsing, and also loans, which have been issued out by the bank. So these reserves and loans represent the assets of the bank, and the deposits, which are obligations to all savers, represent the liabilities for the bank. Okay. Now, a balance sheet always has to match, otherwise it's invalid. So therefore, total assets must equal total liabilities, and therefore R plus L is equal to D plus this E term, which is equity. Don't worry about it for now. Big R has this special relationship with the deposits. So big R is equal to small r times D. So what is R, the small r here? That is the reserve requirement. So that is the minimum proportion of deposits that the bank must hold as reserves in order to meet sudden requests for withdrawals from all depositors. Okay, so R is a measure of liquidity from the deposit side, and therefore it's also known as the deposit withdrawal risk. So this is set by the reserve, the central bank. All right. E, the equity component here, E also has a relationship with L. So E is equal to small e times L. And this E basically represents the loan default risk. So if a fraction of the loans goes into default, that is, a fraction of loans fail, then the bank must hold enough reserves on the liability side as well in order to protect itself against insolvency, against bankruptcy. So this relationship represents the amount of equity that the bank must hold in order to control for possible loan defaults. Okay. Now let's take an example and try and understand how banks are interconnected with each other. So let's say the banking system comprises a set of banks here, wherein each bank has two conditions to follow. E is 0, meaning the equity can be 0 in the system, the equity held by each bank, but each bank also has a minimum reserve requirement of 0.2, which is 20%. Okay, so out of all deposits, 20% should be held as reserves by each bank as safeguard, right? These reserves must be deposited with the central bank. So that these reserves that exist on the asset side are not held by the bank. It's deposited immediately with the central bank, right? And the loans are obviously issued to members of the public. And let's say the central bank wants to release $1,000 into the economy, because again, the central bank is the one that controls the monetary system. It controls the amount of money circulating in the economy. So let's say the central bank decides to introduce an extra $1,000 into the economy. So how can it do that? It can probably, let's say, pay all of us an extra $1,000 into our bank accounts, right? So what happens? Let's say all of us initially are at bank A, right? Some of us at least, and all these $1,000 are given to the depositors of bank A, right? So deposits appear here, and immediately they have to be matched on the asset side of the balance sheet of bank A, wherein the bank immediately must deposit $200 out of these $1,000 extra deposits with the Reserve Bank. And then it has excess reserves of $800. Okay, what can bank A do with these excess reserves? It has to deposit these $200 with the central bank. But what about the extra $800?
Issue loans.
Yes, that's how the bank makes money. So in period 2, the bank issues this extra $800 as loans. And let's say all loans are issued to deposit to customers of bank B. Okay. Now, when a bank issues a loan, it usually deposits that money in whatever account you ask it to deposit. So let's say all these loans went in period 2 to depositors at bank B. So now bank B experiences an increase in deposits of $800. Now, once again, bank B is supposed to keep 20% of this and deposit it with the central bank. And it has an excess reserve of $640 in period 2. So naturally, by the beginning of period 3, now bank B will also do its job of issuing those excess reserves as loans, which again might end up in bank C. And again, bank C repeats the same process. It keeps $128 as required reserves with the central bank, and then it can issue the excess $512 as loans. So this is what happens by the beginning of period 4, right? So what happened here? This process can continue ad infinitum. So it can continue forever amongst all the banks involved with that are part of the system, right? all the reserves are deposited with the central bank, as I mentioned. But what has happened here is that when the central bank introduced an extra $1,000 into the economy in period 0, over time, these deposits have expanded across all the banks involved. Right? In period 1, you saw only $1,000 deposits in bank A, but then 800 of this appeared in bank B in period 2. And then by period 3, $640 of this appeared in bank C. Right? So this is known as deposit expansion. It does not affect the total amount of reserves within the banking systems. For example, remember in period 1, bank A had $1,000 deposits. In period 2, bank A has $200, which is in the form of reserves, and bank B has these $800 as reserves. So the actual level of deposit doesn't really matter much. All the actual level of reserves remains the same, but the deposits itself expands over time. That's how money is introduced into the modern monetary system. Okay, what do you see here? Look at how the balance sheet of each bank is connected. There's some kind of an overlap between the balance sheet of bank A and bank B and bank C. This is how banks at the very basic are connected to each other. Do you see any? Now, obviously, one of the advantages is deposit expansion. So loans are issued by bank A, some loans are issued by bank B, and some loans are issued by bank C. What is the total amount of loans issued? This is much more than $1,000. Right? So this is one of the key advantages of deposit expansion. Do you see any problems with this? This is not in the slides, but because of the interconnectedness of banks, do you see any issues with that? What happens if, let's say, bank C fails?
You'll get like a domino effect.
Exactly. You will get like a domino effect. If bank C fails, then that threatens the loan portfolio of bank B. Then all customers of bank B will run to get the deposits, possibly causing the collapse of bank B. And if that happens, then immediately bank A, or maybe at the same time, depositors of bank A might also rush to withdraw their money. This is typically how banks fail, multiple banks fail during a financial crisis. Okay.
I wanted to ask
yes.
whether the deposits, is this a savings account or all deposit account? Because you don't get the returns on just regular deposits. So then my question is, how is this kind of legal, I guess?
Well, there's nothing about whether this is legal or not. So now so these are basically savings accounts. Okay. Now, of course, today, if you deposit your money at any given bank, especially in the United States or Europe, you will hardly get any return on it, maybe 0.01% interest. But back in the day, it used to be around, if I remember correctly, it was 0.5 or even up to 1% on your savings. So people were actually incentivized to put the money in the bank. Now, because of inflation today, you're hardly incentivized to put that money. Now, there is nothing illegal about it. Like, this is just how money flows within the monetary system. Again, is it a good thing or a bad thing? That's up for debate. I mean, this is how things work. And obviously, without proper safeguards, what happens is if banks are too much interconnected and some of these loans are issued to risky borrowers, then it's not just the risky borrowers and their associated banks who get punished and the depositors, but all the other banks which might have given better loans might also get affected because each of their loan portfolios is exposed to banks further down within the economy. So you have this domino effect, which it's also known as contagion. So contagion basically means crisis at one bank spreads to all the other banks because of this interconnection amongst the balance sheets. Okay.
But isn't this interconnectivity doesn't scare the banks that much? Because as we saw in 2008, the top bankers knew that they were going to be, what's the word I'm looking for, bailed out by the government.
Yes.
And therefore they weren't incentivized to look for good loans.
Yeah, indeed. That is a problem, right? That is that is basically our governments failing us, right? And to add salt to the wound, none of the bankers who were responsible for causing the financial crisis ever went to jail. Now, how worse is that? So that's something we need to think about. And hopefully when some of you become bankers, maybe I would urge none of you to get tempted by those things and do your job properly. It's a sad thing that, you know, in the real world, these kinds of shocks tend not to get controlled or accounted for, and that actually tends to cause crisis more often than not, right? It's just a problem that, you know, we as a collective human society have failed to address, but we should, hopefully. Okay. I see a lot of interest on the financial crisis. Actually, so lecture 4 is completely dedicated to that. So we'll discuss what securitization is, which is how banks got to offload some of their risky loans out to other interested parties, but still they were affected. We'll see how that permeated. Okay. All right. So this was it for today. I'm guessing we are finishing a bit ahead of schedule. What I would do is, I think we are meeting next week for one lecture. So during that, yeah, we'll have lecture 3 next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions, do shoot me an email and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. Any questions for the things we discussed today? All right. I've also put up some additional slides just for information. Again, this is useful, but again, optional. I've just put some extra slides on different types of financial intermediaries. Basically, you can split intermediaries into depository and non-depository FIs. Okay, FIs are financial intermediaries for short. So depository FIs are basically commercial banks and other entities that accept money in the form of deposits and issue them out as loans. So in some ways, their function is pretty limited. They accept money as deposits and they just lend them out as loans. Non-depository FIs finance their activities through capital markets. They get their money in other ways and not in the form of deposits. And obviously, because of differences in how they source their money, the risks and obligations that these different types of FIs have varies. And they're also subject to different kinds of regulations. So for example, investment banks, private equity and venture capital are subject to different types of regulation compared to commercial banks. Hedge funds are hardly regulated, right? So if you're interested in this, again, read chapters 2 and 3, get to know more about what each of these different types of FIs represent. And who knows, maybe you'll work in some of these going down the future. All right. Again, some more examples, some more slides. Again, showing the historical evolution of how much money has flown into depository versus non-depository intermediaries. You'll see that many non-depository FIs have actually become big in the last 20-30 years, and more money is flowing on the non-depository side, which is also adding to the risk, because non-depository FIs tend to take on more risk when making their investments compared to depository FIs. Okay, that was it. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye and take care.